everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fixing a Hole, the Beatles podcast you didn't know you needed. This is episode 44. My name is Mark Wakely from 1386 Audio. I am the producer, and as I always say, the idiot in the room. I don't mind being self-deprecating in that way. But the real expert who talks about the Beatles, knows everything about the Beatles, lives the Beatles, and all that other stuff, and has a massive collection of Beatles, which his wife is not too sure about, is my Beatles wizard, Paul Humbly. Hi, Paul. How are you?
I'm fine. Don't talk about my Beatles collection like that. She doesn't know where half of it's kept.
She probably doesn't know what half of it's worth either. I always tell her that I only paid £2 for the albums.
Yeah. Oh, I've had this one for years. So why are you carrying it in from the car? I just found it.
It's the whole thing, isn't it, about, but all the guitars sound the same. No, they don't. My brother's got 22 guitars, you know that. Yeah, and his wife says, they all sound the same. No, they don't. Rickenbackers are not Stratocasters.
Well, her favourite comment is, are you going to play this one, or is it just for looking at? I think she knows the answer to that. It's for looking at.
See, all my records are for playing, but there we go. Anyway, that's another story, which I might tell you one day about my record collection. Brilliant, Paul. Now, obviously, in the last one, we talked about those films and stuff like that. What did we talk about? That'll Be the Day, Hard Day's Night, Stardust, and Slade in Flame. So if you want to know what we feel about music films, then listen to last week's episode. But this week, we're completely going off in a different direction, aren't we, Paul? What are we going to be talking about this week?
Well, as we record this in February 2026, I'm still not used to saying 2026.
I still write down 25 sometimes.
We're 59 years away from the release of the Beatles' double A-side single, Strawberry Fields Forever, Penny Lane, which amazingly never made number one in the UK. And so I thought we'd look at that single and see if we can find out why it never made the top spot.
I think, as I said at the end of the last podcast, because people are stupid. Right, well, the thing... Right, so Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields, I think, are possibly... I think that's the pinnacle. I really do. I love both songs. I think they're both fantastic. They're both quite a bit of a surprise, although Revolver is leaning in that direction. So let's look at that. So, you look at the final track on Revolver, Tomorrow Never Knows. We had a conversation about this before we started the podcast, about the tape loops and all the stuff in there. And anybody who sits there and goes, oh, right, okay, this is the way the Beatles are going, it signposts what's going to happen. People maybe thought, oh, that's a bit weird, but they'll be back to Mop Toppy and all that sort of stuff. But of course they didn't. They never went back to that style of music, except for Get Back, probably. So quickly before we go to this bit, what were the last two singles before Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane, double A side?
So in April 66, you get Paperback Writer Back with Rain, which is showing that the Beatles are going in a different direction.
Yeah, I think Paperback Writers are definitely moving away from the Mop Toppy things. And Rain definitely is.
Absolutely.
A great drummings.
And then you get an unusual situation where the album Revolver is released on the 5th of August 1966 in the UK, and on the same day, two songs are released as a single that are taken directly from the album, which is quite unusual for the Beatles, in the UK at least. And the single Eleanor Rigby, Yellow Submarine, is released. So I think it's fair to say, if you look at the production style of at least three of those four songs, I think Rain is the exception, because it is very much telegraphing that there's a new direction here, whereas the other three songs are suggesting it. There are definite signals that the production of Beatles songs is changing. But interestingly enough, the last song on Revolver, which is Tomorrow Never Knows, is actually the first song that they record for that album. Which
I always find quite weird, because you think they think, right, well, we've done Tomorrow Never Knows, let's move on to Strawberry Fields. But it's not that at all, is it?
No.
They do I'm Only Sleeping and all the other stuff after that.
Yeah.
Which I find quite interesting.
Yeah. And, and also on Revolver, you've got songs like, Here, There and Everywhere, fantastic song. Its roots clearly lie in the B-side of I Want to Hold Your Hand, which is a song called This Boy, which is a three-part harmony song. And, you know, something like Got to Get You Into My Life is definitely, although it's soul influence is, you know, are there with the brass, etc. That's
proved by the fact that Earth, Wind and Fire did a great cover
version of it. But it's you know, if you listen to a Hard Day's Night album and then listen to Got to Get You Into My Life, they're not a million miles away. It's, you know, it's obvious it's the same group, and there's nothing to make the listener wary of, you know, there's some new direction this band are going in. It's interesting that Revolver is actually a mix of styles, whereas, as we know, by the time they get to the next album, Sgt. Pepper, they have just 100% gone in a new direction.
Oh, absolutely. I think the interesting thing as well is that you can see that slow progression, and we've talked about Rubber Soul as well, and the way Rubber Soul is starting to move out of the Fab Four type mould, and there's tracks on that, definitely, you know, Norwegian Wood is a classic case, where they're moving out of that. Revolver, again, is a little bit further on, a little bit more, and, you know, by the time we get to Tomorrow Never Knows, it's definitely moved away from that.
Yeah.
And we're into tape loops and stuff in reverse and all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, along comes Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields, both of which I think are incredible. And the two things I love on these two songs, one is the piccolo trumpet on Penny Lane, and the other is the fact they're using a mellotron on Strawberry Fields. And I think, you know, the mellotron is cutting edge at the time, isn't it?
It is.
It's one of the newest things, and I think that's quite interesting.
But I think this is where we need to just stop and reflect on 1966, because I pulled out the top 100 singles in the UK from 1966.
Okay.
And so we've just been talking about the different directions that the album Revolver's going in, and it's, you know, the closing track Tomorrow.
I mean, there is an argument that Yellow Submarine's a little bit psychedelic in its way.
Very, very much so. So if we look at the best-selling single in the UK in 1966, it's not the Beatles. They're actually at number 3 with Yellow Submarine. It's actually a country artist, Jim Reeves, with a song called Distant Drums. And number 2 is Frank Sinatra with Strangers in the Night. And at number 7, we've got Tom Jones with The Green, Green Grass of Home. And I think all of a sudden that puts the Beatles where they are in mid-1966 completely in context.
I mean, they've gone from being the biggest pop band in the world to being almost the alternative when you look at the context of the charts at that time.
Yeah.
And we were talking about media influence at the time. 66 is the height of the pirate radio boom, when there was more pirate stations on there than ever. But the pirate radio stations, nobody thinks, it's 24-hour pop music and stuff like that. Yeah, Radio London was very like that. Caroline was very similar as well. But there were stations out there just playing what they called easy listening, sweet music. Yeah. And there was Radio 390 and there was Britain Radio, and Radio City were quite like that as well. And quite a bit of Caroline's nighttime music was also like that. So it wasn't the 24-hour, fast-talking American pop format that you think was out there. Yeah. There was an awful lot of stations that were playing Frank Sinatra, Engelbert Humperdinck, etc., etc.
Exactly the same thing was happening in the United States. The Capitol Records were putting out easy listening covers albums of Beatles songs. So I think it's the Holly Ridge Strings. I think I've got that right. And albums like that were selling in huge volumes because Capitol wouldn't be doing it if they weren't. They wouldn't be wasting money and time. As we've said in a previous podcast, what the record labels are interested in is shifting product. It doesn't matter what it is as long as it sells. So they wouldn't have been selling this easy listening material if it didn't sell.
The other thing, again, just very quickly going back to the radio station thing again, is that for all the talk of pirate radio and all the pirate radio things, there were only certain parts of the country that could pick those stations up, clearly. The light programme was still playing Mantovani and all that kind of stuff, lots of easy listening. Yeah. And, they didn't want to play pop music, but they were quite happy to play, Sinatra, which they'd been playing since the 50s, and, things like Engelbert Humperdinck and stuff. I think Tom Jones was a bit out there for them at the time.
Yeah.
But this was the thing, that predominantly, the predominant music of the period is still what we would now call easy listening, MOR, middle of the road type stuff, which I think is quite interesting. And that's what most people are still listening to the BBC. You know, Mrs. Dale's Diary and the Archers.
and I think also, you know, 1967 is looked upon as this great revolution in music. So, you know, with pop acts evolving into becoming rock acts, you know, which is exactly what's happening with the Beatles and the Stones, the Who, etc. You've also got the Summer of Love and the hippie generation and bands like, you know, album-related bands like the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane, you know, forming in the States.
It's only a couple of years later we got Led Zeppelin's first album.
Yes, and so I think the perception is that we look back, you know, 60 years later and think that's what the music scene was like. But actually, these artists that we're talking about and this style of music, this rock music and this psychedelic music, was very much still on the fringes of what the average consumer wanted.
I totally agree with you. Another Beatles associated act, Cilla Black, you know, she was very much middle of the road type music.
Yeah.
You know, and those people like Lulu, there's a lot of people out there who were still very much of the Saturday Night at the London Palladium style acts, I think.
Yeah.
And I think the Beatles did become an exception quite quickly because of things like Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane. Mm-hmm. So it didn't get to number one. Is this why? Because it didn't have the popular appeal that the previous singles had had?
I've been thinking about this, and when you get to 1967, and I had this conversation with a friend of mine over Facebook only in the last week. I posted something on my personal page about some music that I was listening to, and this person came back and said, "Oh, I prefer the Beatles when they were the Mop Tops. When they went all psychedelic and took drugs and went to India, I don't like that. That's not the Beatles to me." And I think what Strawberry Fields Penny Lane does as a single is it's a definite marker as to the Beatles have moved on to stage 3 of their career.
Well, it came out of the recording sessions for Pepper, didn't it?
It did.
So, you know, it's all part of that same, for the want of a better word, psychedelic period that they were recording in. And also, the other thing we've got to remember about this is that they had stopped touring by this point.
Yeah.
And they've got loads of time to make records.
And this is the thing. So although their last single and last album are issued in the UK on the 5th of August 66, and it's now the 17th of February 67, before you get this new material, they actually start recording again in November 66. And so there's a lot of work gone into you know, what is going to be their next album. And they select these 2 songs. To put it into context, it could have been Strawberry Fields back with When I'm 64, or Penny Lane When I'm 64, because they were the 3 songs that were completed. And, you know, George Martin said on numerous occasions, was this the biggest mistake he made with the Beatles by not putting these 2 songs on Pepper? But I think he did absolutely the right thing, because I think he set up listeners' expectations of where Pepper was going to get, you know, was going to take the listener and the fan and music in general. But also at the same time, he probably put out one of the greatest 45s that's ever been produced.
I totally agree with you. Mm-hmm. Let's just have a quick look back at this business about time. Mm-hmm. So the Beatles, up until the point they stopped touring, were touring pretty much constantly. Mm-hmm. They were in America a lot. They were all over the country. They were going all over the world. They were in Japan, the famous Philippines trip, which was never going to happen again. And all these different places. They've been to South America. They've been all over the place. And, of course, a lot of that time is hotel rooms and travelling. All of a sudden, they've got all this time back. So they've gone from being a band on the road and writing and recording when they've got a chance to being a band with all the time in the world. All they've got to do is record. They've decided they're going to be a studio band from now on.
Yeah, because the tour they did in 66, well, the various tours they did in 66, has confirmed to them that they can no longer perform the music that they're recording in the
Because they
studio.
can't hear it.
Yeah, because A, they can't hear it, plus also you haven't got synthesizers and electronic equipment that can reproduce the sounds.
Yeah,
And-
nobody's going to be standing there shouting, "Tomorrow never knows."
And when they do perform a song like Paperback Writer, which you can hear for yourself, it just doesn't sound like
Well,
the
they
single.
can't hear each other for the harmonies either. You've got
No.
Paperback Writer's got all those harmonies in it,
Yeah.
and counterpoints,
Yeah.
and they can't hear themselves, so there's
Yeah.
no point.
And so what they decide is, if we're becoming a studio band, we are going to go into this 110%, and we haven't got to worry about performing it on stage. We can just do whatever the studio technology allows
Yeah.
us to do, and wherever our brains, and to some extent wherever the drugs take us.
Well, there's always that thing about that creativity always expands into the space available for it to happen. And I think one is that George Martin gave them the freedom to do this and said, yeah, we can do this or whatever. Jeff Emmerich, which we will talk about in another podcast episode at some point in the future, who was in charge of the sort of the engineering side of the whole thing. Yeah, we can do this. Yeah, we can do this. And they worked out how they could speed up and slow down tape recorders to change the pitch and all that kind of stuff. And this is, and we'll talk about Strawberry Fields in a minute in the context of that. And Paul going along saying, yeah, I heard this thing I was watching the Proms, and there was a guy, this really high trumpet. And he goes, oh, what, like a piccolo trumpet? Yeah, that would sound really good on my new song. And I think the other thing I love about the Penny Lane Strawberry Fields is it's a Paul song and a John song. And I think we talked about this before as well, is that both those songs go back to their childhoods.
They go back to their childhoods. They both know, Paul knows what Strawberry Fields is, John knows what Penny Lane is, and when he's looking at the lyrics and seeing, the barber, the banker, the fireman, etc., he knows exactly what Paul's referring to. So and so do George and Ringo. So when they're making those songs, recording those songs, they can all buy into it. It's not some sort of fantasy land or something like that. They know exactly what.
It's not Lucy in the Sky, is it?
Yeah, they know exactly what John and Paul are conjuring up with the lyrics.
Yeah,
which I think is very important. But also, probably part of the problem is, unless you were from Liverpool, you wouldn't know that Penny Lane is a street in Liverpool. Unless you were a particular person or somebody knew that Strawberry Fields in Liverpool was a Salvation Army home, that wouldn't mean anything. So, whereas, a previous single like Paperback Writer was obviously telling the story about somebody, an author trying to write a book, or Eleanor Rigby was, this sad song about lonely people, etc., that people can buy into that. Whereas, well, what does Strawberry Fields Forever mean?
But the only thing I'll say about that, and I understand what you're saying, but if you look at a lot of American songs reference, before, look at Route 66 or whatever, and even then later ones, Rockaway Beach and, those sort of things, Ventura Highway, think of all those songs that have got the names of places in them.
Yeah.
I think that there is that romanticism about that. I mean, I think Wichita Lineman is another classic case of that, which, how many people who listened to that song back in 1970, whenever, when it was released, even knew where Wichita was.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same with these songs. What they do is it creates a really personal connection for the band. And I think it gives the new fans, certainly the newer fans who like something to latch onto as well.
I totally understand what you're saying, and I can see it with Penny Lane, because the title Penny Lane suggests a street, and if you listen to the words, yes, it's definitely a street. The only thing a listener who's not from Liverpool would think is this a fantasy that Paul's made up, or is it an actual place? But if you listen to the lyrics, if you study the lyrics of Strawberry Fields Forever, what's it about? Because it doesn't actually say, well, Strawberry Fields Forever is a Salvation Army home that I, used to visit in my childhood. It's just John building a song around a phrase that he likes.
Which I think is how a lot of songs come about.
Yeah.
the other thing, I'll say about that is that how many people are actually sitting there looking for meanings of lyrics, certainly in that period of meanings of lyrics. Penny Lane, bounces along. It's a great pop song. Mm-hmm. And I think Strawberry Fields, again, is a really good ethereal soundscape almost, because of the mellotron, which was a completely new instrument. I think that had a lot to do with it. But so that's my feeling about it. I mean, I'm not sure people were looking for big meaning in the lyrics of Strawberry Fields.
But I think if you put it again into context, if you look at the paperback writer Rain single, in my opinion, and I think a lot of people now who are into the Beatles would say that Rain is probably their favourite of the two, but it's the B-side. With this single, it's a double, from the word go, it's a double A-side. I think if Penny Lane had been the featured song that was played on the radio all the time.
The plug side, as they used to call it.
Side, yeah. I think it probably would have stood more chance of, climbing that extra space and be in a position and becoming a number one in the UK. I think that the fact that airplay was obviously being split between the two songs, that's what, when it comes to Strawberry Fields, that's what a lot of the easy listening generation of listeners couldn't get their head round.
Very possibly, yes. Whether the people who were buying Frank Sinatra were also buying Beatles songs is a different story altogether. I think they're very different, to be honest. And when we look at, they call it the hottest streak in pop music, which is the Kinks, really. And they've got some really funny little quirky songs as well, Dedicated Following Fashion and all those sort of things, and Waterloo Sunset and whatnot. Some of them are about places. Yeah. And I think that I can see why the Beatles did what they did and why the Kinks are doing what they're doing. Let's talk about 1967 a little bit. And as you have already pointed out, it's the year really rock music really explodes. We get Jimi Hendrix comes along all of a sudden. And then, you've got people like Eric Clapton and so on. And The Who are becoming more rocky in what they're doing. We're looking at a crossover year, aren't we, 67, really, from being predominantly what we would call bubblegum pop to much more rock style stuff. But then the easy listening is dominating the charts as well, isn't it? I mean, what's happening at this time?
Well, what I did while I was researching this episode, I thought, well, let's have a look at early 1967 and what's in the charts. So if you're a pop music fan, you're a typical Beatles fan, you would be interested in quite a lot of the music that's coming out. So, for example, Jeff Beck, Hi-Ho Silver Lining, Purple Haze by Jimi Hendrix, Knock on Wood by Eddie Floyd, The Monkees with A Little Bit Me, Little Bit You, The Move, I Can Hear the Grass Grow. Now, The Move are one of those bands who, because they never really had huge successful albums, they tend to be forgotten about now.
Jeff Lynne and Roy Wood, though.
Yeah. Whereas, the singles that they were making were fantastic. And so, there's a lot going on.
First
there.
record played on Radio 1, Flowers in the Rain.
That's right, yeah. And you've got things like Pictures of Lily by The Who, Happy Together by the Turtles. There's the music that, in hindsight, if you're looking back now, 60 years, that's what you would expect to be in that chart. But then the surprise is, if you look at what's actually doing really well in the charts and getting the high placings...
I know what you're going to say here.
You've got If I Were a Rich Man by Topol from the Fiddler on the Roof, Val Doonican, Memories Are Made of This, The Dubliners, Seven Drunken Nights...
a great song, I'd like to point out.
Petula Clark, This Is My Song. Vince Hill, Edelweiss. Harry Seacombe, This Is My Song. It's very much, the top 10 is dominated by more easy listening sounds. There is one interesting phenomenon I did spot, is that, again, in this early 67 period, ska is quite high in the charts. And I was quite shocked when I saw this. Guns of Navarone by the Scatolites and Al Capone by Prince Buster are actually in the top 20. And
2 brilliant tracks as well.
And I always assumed that, or knew they'd reached the charts, but I didn't realise that they'd actually got so high. And I thought that they were more sort of 65, 66 period. I didn't realise it was 67. So there is this phenomena of ska.
So I think what that shows is the cultural change in the country as well.
Yeah.
And the fact that things like ska, which is coming over from, Jamaica, from the West Indies generally, and there's been calypso as well. I think that it's starting to influence the charts a little bit.
Yeah.
And we're moving into Motown period as well.
Well, you've already had the Motown period, as in, songs like Baby Love, You Can't Hurry Love, those sort of stompers, as I would have called them. But what you are seeing that is during 66 and then obviously into 67, the psychedelic Norman Whitfield productions of Motown is appearing. And
which I would say culminates in What's Going On at the end.
Yeah.
1971.
And I think what we are starting to see here is that by 67, the newer sounds are sort of sitting, let's say, 40-60 in the ease and listening favour. But by the time we get to the sort of 1972-73, they're still easy listening in the charts. And an example I can think of is Eye Level by the is it the Norman Park Orchestra? Simon Park Orchestra, which was the theme tune to a detective
Van der Valk.
Yeah. You would still get something like that would just race to the top of the charts. But by then, it's about that's about 30% of the charts, and the balance has changed.
But those things still dominate to a certain extent because, when you look at Grandad or you look at the St Winifred School Choir or you look at Shut Up in Your Face, famously keeping Vienna off number 1, and those sort of things, there's always been that either novelty or easy listening aspect.
Yeah.
Cliff was still having hits well into almost the 80s. Yeah. Well into the 80s. So, and he was very much in his easy listening phase then. Mm-hmm. My feeling about this is that there's always been that. I remember when I worked at record shops and we knew that if an album was going to be TV advertised, and the one I always think of is the Ken Dodd albums at Christmas, we were going to sell them by the truckload.
Yeah.
There's a reason why when you go into a second-hand record shop, the racks are full of Leo Sayer and Cliff Richard albums from the 70s and 80s. It's because they sold lots of them.
They did.
And they were incredibly popular artists. And I would say most of them were very much MOR, middle of the road.
But what I'm getting at is when we come to 67, when, February 67, when Strawberry Fields Penny Lane is released, the majority of the record buying public are still in that easy listening, middle of the road camp. It's not until the early 70s that it flips around, and you're quite right. Those albums, those songs are still selling, but they're now not in the majority. There's still a huge audience. It has flipped around.
I think we forget. It's like if you say, look at 76 and 77, punk explosion. If you look at the charts, there's a bit of punk in there, but it certainly isn't the dominant format.
Yeah.
And you could count the punk bands on the fingers of one hand quite easily who were in the top 20.
Yeah.
It was still mostly the Shakin' Stevens type artists who were still kicking around then and releasing stuff. I think even Elvin Stardust.
I think a great example is when you think, punk supposedly, what was promoted by the fact that it was, keeping those dinosaur rock acts out, we didn't want to listen to them. And then, right in the middle of all of this, Pink Floyd released The Wall, release a single for the first time in God knows when and
it gets to number 1.
And it gets to number 1. And it stays there for a number of weeks.
And Johnny Rock with his famous I hate Pink Floyd t-shirt.
And you're thinking there's these, as all artists are, and we've said it earlier in this podcast, as far as the record companies are concerned, they are selling product and they will promote it however way they think it's going to sell. But at the end of the day, it comes down to the listening audience.
When you get away from the Stranglers, the Clash, the Sex Pistols, the Buzzcocks, Susie and the Banshees, you're struggling then to think of what I would call proper punk bands. There's some sort of pop punk bands, you know, the Undertones and Boomtown Rats. But you're struggling to think of real, genuine punk bands that really had any impact at all, I think.
Yeah.
And they certainly weren't dominating the charts at that point. You know, we hear all the stories about God Save the Queen. But the truth of the matter is that it was all a bit of a flash in the pan.
Yeah.
That original punk thing. I'm not saying it you know, it didn't have an influence, of course it did. And I think it's the same with, you know, you look at 67, they go, oh, the Summer of Love and stuff like that. But really, as you've already pointed out, maybe a third, a quarter even, of what was in the chart then was really what I would call Summer of Love type songs.
Yeah.
Most of it was still pop music.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah. And one thing I wanted to point out is if you look at the chart history of Penny Lane, Strawberry Fields, it's released on the 17th of February, 67, of a Friday, because that's when EMI and most record companies would release products then, because you pick up the weekend sales because people have just been paid, and that's what it's all about, you know. So it's released on the 17th. It enters the charts on the 23rd of February, and it goes straight in at number 5. Now, it is true, a lot of Beatles singles didn't ever go straight in at number 1. They would normally go in at a lower number and then go to number 1 the following week.
You didn't want your song going in too high,
yeah,
because it would peak too early, you wouldn't sell enough copies. You
Yeah.
wanted it to creep up to the top of the charts.
So it goes in on the 23rd of February at number 5, and Engelbert Humperdinck with Please Release Me is number 1. And, you know, and that's the famous story. And, you know, even on the Beatles anthology, they talk about this, how this, you know, this most psychedelic of Beatles singles is kept off the charts by an easy listening standard. The following week, Penny Lane, Strawberry Fields goes to number 2, where it stays for the next 3 weeks. And Engelbert Humperdinck is keeping it off the number 1 spot. Week number 5, Penny Lane drops down to number 5. Engelbert Humperdinck still at number 1. Penny Lane drops down to number 10, then to number 8 by week 7, and Engelbert Humperdinck is still number 1. Penny Lane keeps going down, but it's interesting. The following week, Penny Lane, Strawberry Fields is at number 12, but there's a new number 1, Something Stupid by Frank Sinatra and Nancy Sinatra, which stays there for a couple of weeks. And then Strawberry Fields keeps dropping down the charts till eventually its final chart position is number 50. And by this time, Sandy Shaw and Puppet on a String is at number 1. But again, there's a glimpse of something that's coming in the future, because if we go back to the 9th week of Penny Lane, Strawberry Fields chart activity, when that single's at number 23, at number 20 is a new group called Pink Floyd with their debut single Arnold Lane, which actually peaks at number 20 and is showing the way for where music is going to start to go. And interestingly enough, Pink Floyd are a group, although this single is produced by Joe Boyd, the first Pink Floyd album, which is in the, you know, is going to shortly start being made, is produced by Norman Smith, who prior to Jeff Emerick was the Beatles sound engineer. So there's a link there. But it's a bit like that observation I made earlier that there's 2 ska songs in the charts. When you dig deep enough, in amongst all this easy listening material, there's a song from the debut single by Pink Floyd, who are going to be this humongous psychedelic progressive rock band, with a single, Arnold Lane, which is about a man who collects washing from people's washing lines at night. You know, so it's the most peculiar, you know, subject matter. And again, you know, that must have appealed to people that like Penny Lane, Strawberry Fields, but must have alienated people who were into Please Release Me by Engelbert Humperdinck.
I don't think that alienate them. I just think that it wasn't their thing. You know, there's lots of stuff I don't like, which I wouldn't bother listening to, which was very popular. You know, I can't stand bands like Duran Duran, for example, and people like that. I was never a Roxy Music fan, believe it or not. Yeah, a big Bowie fan. Well, certain periods of Bowie anyway. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the actual recording of these songs. They spent a lot of time on these songs. They've not just all turned up there, set their equipment up and gone, right, let's play the new song, ding, 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 and there we go. You know, it's not Please Please Me, it's not I Want to Hold Your Hand. And famously, you know, they do take after take after take after take of these. There's a great thing about Strawberry Fields, a little documentary about how they put it together. And it's 2 sections of 2 takes, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is John writes Strawberry Fields while he's making the film How I Won the War in Spain. And if you listen to Anthology 2 compilation, there's his original demo cassette recording on there.
Yeah.
And it's a very simple, almost folk song. Then he takes it into the studio in November 66 and they start recording it. And they record a version of it and he's not happy with it because it's lost that sort of innocence of the demo that he's made. And so it's one of those unusual times up until that point where he says, I want to remake it. And they redo it and it becomes a completely different song again. It's in a different tempo. It's a harder sounding song. And at the end of that, he says to George Martin, I'm still not happy with it. I like the beginning of the one version and I like the end of the other. Is there any way we can glue the 2 together? And George Martin famously says, well, they're both in different tempos and they're in different pitches. And John says, well, I'm sure you can sort that out. And by some miracle, George Martin and Jeff Emerick work out that if you slow one down and speed the other one up, they both go into the same key. And, you know, and if you listen now, I think it's about a minute into the song, you can hear there's a definite edit.
Oh, absolutely.
And
yeah.
The 2, you know, if
you're listening for it, you will hear it.
You will hear it.
But then it's exactly the same as Good Vibrations was the same thing, wasn't it?
And it's still nothing like John's original demo. It's gone way beyond that. But it is true, when you listen to those original recordings, with the benefit of hindsight, you know, we can now listen to what John was hearing and you can say, I actually understand why he was being so critical. And by putting the 2 together, it does work.
So Strawberry Fields, we know, and I think really famously, anybody who knows the story, you know, that it had quite a difficult birth, but it became a classic, obviously. And the Mellotron, first time Mellotrons were properly used. Let's have a look at Penny Lane now and the recording of that, and famously Paul coming in saying, I heard something on the television yesterday.
Yeah.
So tell me the story of that.
So that song was more formed and it had a definite direction when they start recording it in the studio. Where it evolves is the instrumentation that's the orchestral instrumentation that's used in it. So during the anthology, you hear a version of it where there's an oboe more prominent in the instrumentation, and it's still Penny Lane, but it just sounds different, and it just doesn't sound quite so poppy, and it doesn't sort of grab you. You know, Penny Lane is one of those songs when you hear it on the radio, even now, it grabs your attention.
Definitely.
And you're there and you're listening. So what happened was he was watching the television one evening and he was watching one of Bach's Brandenburg concertos.
Was it the Proms or something it was watching? I can't remember now.
I'm not sure. I know it was Bach's Brandenburg concerto. And he heard this very high-pitched trumpet and he went into the studio the next day and said to George Martin, I was watching this programme, there was this very high-pitched trumpet. And he said, yeah, it's a piccolo trumpet. And he said, could we try that sound? And they actually got the guy from the same orchestra, a guy called Dave Mason, into the studio. And literally, Paul just said to him, this is the song we're recording. Can you play something that fits along? And they just played.
Of course I can. I'm a musician.
And he just improvised various pieces until there was this one that fitted in exactly. That's it. That's what I want. And so it was a happy accident. If Paul hadn't been hadn't been at home watching the television that evening, he would never have heard that instrument and it would never appear on that single.
Yeah, it's interesting that, there's quite a bit of that as well, isn't there? Well, they're saying, I've heard this. Can you try that? And this sound would look good.
Yeah.
So quickly going back to Strawberry Fields, there's that funny bit at the end as well, which I always think, is it the end of that song or is it the beginning of the next song? But it's the end of Strawberry Fields, isn't it? And it's another one of these funny little tape loop things.
Well, what it is, if you listen to all of the outtakes, a lot of which are now available via Anthology, you realise it's one of the versions that John had decided he didn't want to use. It's the tail end of one of those where the Beatles are just jamming. But most interestingly, you hear, I think it's John saying cranberry sauce repeatedly, which actually appears on the tail end of Strawberry Fields on the final single, but because the sound's been adjusted and slowed down, it sounds like he's saying, I buried Paul, which is one of the clues as to why Paul McCartney isn't Paul McCartney. He's William Campbell, and he's a lookalike that joined the Beatles in 1967. But that's something we're going to talk about in a future podcast.
Well, what do you know that other people don't know? That's interesting. Yeah, I've always found that funny little bit at the end. And again, I think it's a nod to where it's all going.
Yeah.
You know, when you look at Pepper and the fact that they mix the tracks into each other and stuff like that. I think that's all part of it. And then, of course, it ultimately ends up with the side 2 of Abbey Road, and all that kind of, you know, the medley and all that sort of thing. Obviously, we're in a crossover period here, and a lot of people will say, "Oh, but you know, I really love what I call the Red Album period, which is up to '66." And then a lot of people say, "No, I like the Blue Album period, which is '67 and onwards." For me, it's the second half of the Beatles, or the mid bit of the Beatles is my favourite bit, but certainly I'm more second half Beatles. A lot of people walked away from them, didn't they, at this point, and said, no, that's not the Beatles, this is something else completely. Did they lose fans but then gain people at the other end, sort of thing?
I think absolutely, and I think what's important about this period is the Beatles change what they look like. So all of a sudden you've not heard from the Beatles since Revolver, and then when they appear for the promotion of this single, they've all got moustaches and they all look a lot older. Now, whether that was a conscious thing they were doing to, we've got a new sound and we want a new identity. We're not, though, we want to put our foot down and say, we're not mop tops anymore.
Was it so we didn't recognise the new Paul?
Could have been that. But again, that's for another podcast. As we know, with all artists, whether you're a musician, an actor, or, a painter, whatever you are as an artist, you evolve. And by 67, the Beatles have evolved, and they don't want to be mop tops. They want to be recognised as the serious musicians they are. And so they create an image to go along with it. And I think that's very, very key. Something else that they do is this, in the UK, is the first time they issue a single in a picture cover. And that picture cover has pictures of them as young kids on the back, but also has a map in the promotional advertising for the single, which actually shows you where Strawberry Fields is and where Penny Lane is. And then again on the picture sleeve, on the one side there's early childhood photographs, on the other side there's them now with their moustaches, and it's to show you it's a definite message that we've evolved, we've grown up, and this is where we are now.
It's like I said, those two songs have very much gone back to their childhood, but they've been done in a futuristic way, so it's like a back and a forwards thing as well. That is lovely, Paul. Thank you for telling us all about Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields, double A side from 1967, and thanks for all the work you've done on that as well. He's got loads of sheets of paper in front of him and he's still writing notes now. Right, if people want to get in contact with us and want to talk about the podcast, or want to ask us about the podcast, or want a particular subject they want covered on the podcast, or want to be a guest, any of the reasons, what's the best way to get in contact?
You can contact us by email at info@fixingahole.co.uk, or direct message me via the Facebook page, which surprisingly enough is Fixing a Hole.
Easy. There's also the Patreon site if you want to become a member of that Patreon community. Very easy, very cheap. Lots of extra content on there. There's a longer version of the weekly podcast. There's also some extra podcasts which you won't have heard on the weekly podcast as well. and Paul puts other stuff on there as well. So if you would like to join that community and be involved in that, then it's patreon.com/fixing a hole. Go and have a look and see what we've got on offer there. Right then, Paul, let's have a little look at next week. We've just done 44. So what's going to be 45?
So what we're going to look at is how music and the Beatles changed from 1968 into 69. But not just focus on the Beatles. Look at, again, similar to what we've done today, what was going on in the charts at the time. So as the Beatles are recording and releasing Hey Jude and the White Album, the Stones are doing Beggar's Banquet. We get the first Led Zeppelin album, Deep Purple, Tyrannosaurus Rex are evolving into T-Rex, etc. And so I thought we'd have a look at what the Beatles were doing and what was influencing them around that period.
Brilliant. That is absolutely great. So that's next week's episode, which will be dropping into your inboxes on Sunday morning next week. That's great, Paul. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for listening to Fixing a Hole, the Beatles podcast you didn't know you needed. We will speak to you next week. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks.
This is a 1386 audio production.